Okay, here we go. Um, so the sparkler is kind of like an energy releasing experiment, and that's what we're talking about today. Introduction to metabolism. Metabolism is the story of how we nourish ourselves. We've been through the digestive chapter. We just finished it, and that talked about how we actually break down food into the basics, which is amino acids, glucose, proteins, and then absorb them into our body. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how do we deal with these products. Basically, what we have to do is generate ATP, because ATP is what we need. That's the form of energy that our body burns, and all of the chemical processes that happen in our body burn ATP. It's very interesting to sit here and watch the late students come in. Here comes Tiffany. Most energy production, of course, takes place in the mitochondria. That's on the tape, of course. She'll appreciate it. So metabolism is kind of referring to all the chemical reactions in the body, and it's a combination of all of them. Most of the time, we're sort of in equilibrium. Sometimes we burn more than we're taking in. Sometimes we take in more than we're burning. Cellular metabolism is basically a term that refers to all the chemical reactions in the cell. It's not just making energy, though. It's also building things, building proteins, building cells, building new membranes, all the stuff that our cells have to do. And you can sort of summarize this whole lecture, I think, in this diagram right here, which I'm going to go back here so I can read it. If you think about this as the cell membrane right here, the plasma membrane it's illustrated as. So this is inside the cell, and this is outside the cell, the interstitial fluid. And we have to take stuff in order to make it all work and create the energy that we need. And we do that as basically three different things. There's amino acids, which is the breakdown product of proteins, lipids, which are the breakdown products of fats, and simple sugars, which are the breakdown products of both sugars and carbohydrates. We take carbohydrates, break them down into simple sugars where we can really use them. And it all enters into this thing called a nutrient pool. This is a pool of all the stuff that we're going to use to nourish ourselves as nutrients. And then we're going to take that stuff and we're going to either put it together and do anabolism. Anabolism is creating bigger things out of smaller things, right? We've been on that term before. So we're going to make stuff. And that's what this blue arm is right here, and that means we're going to make repairs, we're going to grow, we're going to secrete stuff, and we're going to store stuff up, stored reserves, as fat or as more muscle or whatever. And then we're going to take and start tearing that stuff down. Now, we don't want to tear too much of it down, but we can. We can always tear down what we've built up. And then when we tear it down, we tear it back down into parts again, and it just dumps right back into the nutrient pool, and we can use it again. We can either build new stuff, or we can continue to tear it down even further. And that's what this arrow going down is. So this is real catabolism, where we tear the stuff down, and this really happens pretty much in the mitochondria. Now, in the mitochondria, we create ATP. And then sure enough, about 40% of our catabolism goes to create ATP. And then we have ATP stored that we can use as either to burn as locomotion, to make our muscles move so we can move, to contract, our muscles have to contract. We can use it for intracellular transport. Remember that intracellular transport, moving things around in our cell, the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum and those things, endocytosis, exocytosis, those all take energy, and they're all active processes, so they need ATP. Cytokinesis endocytosis and exocytosis. All of those burn ATP. But here's the key thing, and that is that 60% of all of the energy that we create, we lose it as heat. Now think about that for a minute. This room right now is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, everybody sitting in here has got a body temperature of about 98.6. And that's a very closely regulated body temperature. I can promise you, all of us have a temperature within a half a degree of each other. That's just what our body likes it at 98.6. And by God, we control it very tightly at that level. So, what that means is we've got 30 little furnaces going in here that are generating body heat all the time to keep ourselves warmed up more than the temperature of the room, right? Because if we weren't making energy, if we weren't burning stuff, if we weren't creating heat, we would all be at 72 degrees. And we'd all be dead, by the way, because none of our chemical reactions, none of our enzymes will work at 72 degrees. Okay? So, I always, whenever I get to this slide, I always think, wow, that's amazing. More than half of our energy that we burn is just to keep us warm enough, just to keep us at 98.6. Wow, I never thought about that. Yeah, okay, good. Catabolism, by definition, is a breakdown of organic substrates, causes a release of energy. I've already said that. Anabolism is the synthesis of new organic molecules. And I guess you can probably figure that building up new organic molecules, building a new molecule of actin, or building a new molecule of myosin, that's what makes our muscles contract. Remember those guys? That's a big deal. That takes a lot of energy. That takes a lot of amino acids. Those are really long proteins, and they require thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of amino acids to build those sophisticated proteins. That's anabolism, building things up. So in energy terms, in terms of this energy flow, which is kind of what we're talking about today, anabolism is an uphill process. It takes energy to build new stuff and to make these new chemical bonds that are going to create these new chemicals. Catabolism, on the other hand, is a downhill process that tears down big molecules. It breaks down chemical bonds, and it releases energy. So, if you go back to that earlier diagram, catabolism is going up, and anabolism is going up, catabolism is coming down. It's all going on all the time in us. Let's talk about some of the compounds that are pretty important here. Glycogen. Glycogen is the most abundant storage carbohydrate. Now, carbohydrates, when we say carbohydrates, the simplest carbohydrate, of course, is glucose. But to store glucose, we build up these chains. We hook a bunch of glucoses together, and then it becomes called glycogen, right? And we can store a certain amount of glycogen in our body. And by the way, we can't store all that much. In fact, we can store enough to run about 2 hours on. So if you're running marathons, when they say, oh, he hit the wall at 20 miles, about 2 hours for these good runners, that's when he's running out of glycogen. He's got to shift to some other form of energy because we can't store that much of that stuff. Triglycerides is the most abundant storage lipid. And, I got a bunch here around my belly and around all my guts, and my greater omentum is probably bigger than I can stand to look at. But, that's the form. Triglycerides are the actual chemical that makes up fat. You remember those fat cells, those adipocytes? We call them signet cells. And they've got a big drop of fat in the middle of them. Well, the fat is triglycerides. What does a triglyceride look like, Simona? What's the chemical structure of a triglyceride look like? Anybody?
3 chains, carbon chains.
3 chains of, well, what do we call those chains?
Oh, yeah.
We call those fatty acids, and what's that thing at the end of it called? Glycerol. That's right. So it's a glycerol, and attached to the glycerol is these are fatty acids, and they can be either saturated, unsaturated, polysaturated, and so forth. But there's 3 of them coming out like this. Okay? And the reason that lipids are such a great way to store fat or store energy is because we can tear these things down tearing off 1 carbon at a time. And every time we tear off a carbon, we release the energy from that bond. Then we can tear off another one and make more. So, I think I said that here we are. As far as proteins are concerned, proteins is the biggest part of our body, most abundant organic components in the body, and obviously proteins do all kinds of stuff. Proteins can be as simple as things like collagen, which are just fibers, right? Elastic fibers are made out of proteins too. But muscle is pure protein, basically, and we just have lots and lots of proteins in our body. Each one of which had to be synthesized by putting together, 10 to 20 to 100,000 amino acids to create that protein. All right. So here's another kind of interesting kind of graph, diagram, picture. And if you look up here, you see that the triglycerides are broken down into fatty acids, and then fatty acids are in the nutrient pool. That's something we can burn and use, right? Glycogen, which is the storage carbohydrate we just talked about, it can be broken down into glucose to be put into the nutrient pool. And proteins can be broken down into individual amino acids, and we can actually tear amino acids apart to harvest the energy out of them. All of these things then, fatty acids, glucose, and amino acids, form little small carbon chains, and we can take those little carbon chains and put them into this thing called the TCA cycle, which you probably know better as the Krebs cycle. That's right. The tricarboxylic acid cycle, TCA, also known as the Krebs cycle. And I don't know about you, but I think I memorized the Krebs cycle 6 times in my education, and I forgot it 6 times the next day. It's something you memorize and you forget. That's what it's made for, right? It's made to forget. And so you won't have to learn it here. Isn't that lovely?
Oh, my God. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You just got to know about it, though. You got to know a few things about it.
Okay, just tell me the few things, the little few things.
A few things you need to know we'll talk about here today. So it's not secret. These aren't secrets. So the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the Krebs cycle, throws out a bunch of coenzymes and all this other stuff, and it sends those parts of molecules down, runs it through the electron transport system, and the electron transport system bumps out ATP, which is, remember, what mitochondria are all about. They're the little factories that make the energy in power cells, and then water. There's a little bit of carbon dioxide that comes off the TCA cycle as those small carbon chains are being processed, and it creates CO2. And remember CO2 from 2 chapters ago, because that was the bad gas that we're breathing out all the time. We've got to get rid of CO2. And the way we get rid of CO2, remember, is it's picked up in the interstitial fluid, it's brought into the blood, into the veins, and it's handled in 3 ways, right? It's either hooked onto the hemoglobin as carbamino hemoglobin, or it's dissolved in the serum, in the plasma, just dissolving CO2 gas in the fluid. And what was that third one? Bicarbonate. Yeah, it was switched into bicarbonate, taken to the lungs, switched back, and breathed out. Okay? So there was 3 ways to carry this CO2, but it's got to be carried and then expired because it's a waste product. And if we don't get rid of it, it builds up and we become acidic, right? Because it converts into carbonic acid. Remember that? Okay. So glycolysis is the first stage of this Krebs cycle. It breaks the six carbon glucose. Remember that glucose is six molecules of carbon. You remember we draw it as a little hexagon, and it forms a form of pyruvate, and that's a form of pyruvic acid. Here's the whole cycle, but I really don't want you to learn it because I know you won't remember it. But just for general purposes, remember that you're starting up here with, here's some 3 carbon things, and then it breaks them, and then they plugs them together, and they become 5 carbons, and then here's just 5 carbon again. Now it's 5, and then you break it off to 4 because you're taking a carbon off, and now here you are at 4, and here you are at 4 again, and it just you basically keep going around and around, pulling off 1 carbon at a time, and generating more ATP here. Isn't that ATP?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay? And you're also generating some NADH up here at the top, which is another energy source that we can use. So, what do I want you to know? I want you to know this. For every 1 molecule of glucose, your cell is going to gain about 36 molecules of ATP. Now, just so you know, some biology books say 32 and some say 34, but we're going to say 36, okay? So we're going to make about 36 molecules of ATP from every 1 molecule of glucose. 4 from NADH, 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the tricarboxylic acid cycle, and then 28 from the electron transport system as it goes on down. So what? Another thing you need to know about. What is gluconeogenesis? Think about that. Break that one down. Gluco.
Formation, like.
How about glucose? Neo. Making new glucose. Genesis, making it. Okay, so gluconeogenesis is the synthesis of glucose from other stuff. And what does that mean? Well, that means we can make glucose from the waste products of these other things. We can actually make glucose from proteins. If we're starving and our body is tearing all our muscles down and we're getting skinnier and skinnier and our ribs are starting to show and we're living in Biafra or someplace, they're doing gluconeogenesis all the time. Why? Why does your body need glucose? There's one organ that will only run on glucose. Your brain. That's right. So at all costs, you are always going to have some glucose available. And you're going to tear down your muscles and destroy your proteins, which took you a zillion ATP to build. You're going to tear them down in order to make enough glucose so that your brain will work. It's also making it from these other things like lactic acid, like glycerol, and like amino acids. Once again, amino acids is the breakdown product of proteins, which is what you really don't want to be breaking down. And so as you do this, you can then store that glucose up as glycogen and in both the liver and in your muscles. That way you have some glucose, so your brain will have some glucose so that you can stay conscious. What's glycogenolysis? Well, clearly, glycogenolysis is glycogen lysis. It's the breakdown of glycogen. It's a really quick reaction. It's only one step, and there you go. How about lipids? How do we break down lipids? Lipid molecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Remember these big chains out here? The backbone of the chain is carbon, and hanging off the 2 sides is either hydrogen or OH, or the OH side chain. And if it's double bonds, then they're called unsaturated, right? Single bonds, they're all saturated. Isn't that right? Triglycerides are the most abundant lipid in the body. That's probably worth knowing. And that's because that's what we store, and that's what we store as fat. So here's an example of what fats look like, and I tried to draw one up there on the board, which is really terrible. But basically just know that there's a glycerol on one side, which is a 3-carbon structure, and then hanging off each side, there's 3 side arms, fatty acid 1, fatty acid 2, fatty acid 3. They don't have to be the same fatty acid. They can be different. They're saturated if they all have single bonds. This is another saturated one. Here's an unsaturated one. And the way you know that is because, see, here's a double bond right here. So there's a carbon that doesn't have 2 hydrogens on it. It's got 1 double bonded oxygen on it. That's what makes it unsaturated. If it had a bunch of these, it would be called polyunsaturated. And a lot of oils used to advertise themselves as polyunsaturated because we thought that was healthier for us. I'm not even sure what is healthy for us anymore. It seems complicated. Okay, let's just move along here. So fatty acids, going back to that original, that diagram that we had a few slides back, this is a way fatty acids can be broken down from triglycerides to fatty acids. They take the small carbon chains. We can dump them in through the tricarboxylic acid cycle, as you see right down here. And now we're harvesting energy and we're making ATP out of fat. So we can get energy from fat. And for those of us who go on diets all the time, you know, it's pretty hard. You gotta burn a lot of energy to lose much of that fat. It comes off pretty darn slow. For each 2-carbon fragment removed from a fatty acid, the cell gains about 12 ATPs from acetylcholine, acetyl-CoA in the tricarboxylic acid cycle, 5 ATPs from NADH. And so from an 18-carbon fatty acid molecule, you can get 144 ATP molecules. Well, I'm not sure if that's really worth memorizing, but I can remember it pretty easy because what's another name for 144? You ever heard it called a gross?
No.
They used to sell pencils in a gross. A gross was 144. It's an old word, I guess. I mean, it was really common when I was a child back in the last century.
I was a child in the last century too.
144. Anyway, don't memorize that. But I guess the point making here is that fatty acid breaks down, yields about 1.5 times the energy of glucose breakdown. In other words, we get a lot of energy from fat. It just takes longer. It's not instantly available to us like glucose is instantly available to us. There you go. It can provide large amounts of ATP, but slowly. It also saves space. You can store a lot of fat in a little bit of space. It's very dense in terms of calories per cubic centimeter or calories per ounce or whatever. Fat is hard to break down because most of these enzymes that we use to break it down are water soluble and they can't just dissolve into big fat droplets and digest them quickly. Another thing about fat is that we need fat. And that's how I can always explain eating too much fat, is because I know I need it. It's really good for your brain, and it's really good for your plasma membranes, and it's really good so that your body can make steroid hormones. All the steroid hormones are basically manufactured from fat. Does that make sense? All right. Solubility. Let's talk about that for just a second. Most lipids are not soluble in water. In other words, you know the old Italian dressing thing, how the fat always goes to the top and the water or the vinegar, whatever it is, goes to the bottom. They're not soluble in each other. You can shake them up really good, and they sort of seem like they mix, but they really don't. They're still separated in little droplets. Okay. So how do we get lipids in our bloodstream if we say they're not soluble in water? If they're not soluble in water, they're not going to be soluble in blood, right? So how are we going to pass them around through our body? Well, the way we do that is because we hook them on to these other guys called lipoproteins. So we take the lipid molecule, we hook it onto a lipoprotein with a protein, and then it becomes soluble so it can float through the blood. Okay? Now, that brings up the subject of lipoproteins, and you should know a little bit about this. Not much, pretty much what it says here. Lipoproteins are lipid protein complexes. That's easy enough, right? It's a lipid and it's a protein. They're kind of hooked together, and there's a bunch of different types of them, and here they are. Let's start at the bottom down here. HDLs, high-density lipoproteins. Those are the good ones. Those are really good. Everybody wants to go to their doctor and get their cholesterol level checked, and they want to find out what's my HDL, okay? HDL is your that's the good cholesterol, basically. Low-density lipoproteins are the bad ones. Ones in intermediates or in between. Very lows are very bad. And then even worse than that is chylomicrons. What's a chylomicron? I think we've talked about that before. Chylomicrons are just fat droplets. Remember, they're the things that when the body, in the intestine, in the jejunum, when we're absorbing fat, we actually just pull the fat in as droplets of chylomicrons. They flow into those little things that we call the lacteals. Remember, they're in the wall and in the villi that you can actually see in somebody that's been eating fat shortly before you operate on them. You're looking around in their belly. Those are chylomicrons. They're bad. They're bad. It's just free-floating fat. We don't really want to have too many of them around at all. These are the good guys down here. So as you guys go through your life, what you want to always do is keep your LDLs low, and you want to keep your HDLs high. And because of, if you do that, then you stand a much better chance of not laying down too much fat in the wall of your arteries, which causes arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, narrowing of the arteries, heart attacks, all that stuff. Yes?
Where do triglycerides, like when you get your cholesterol panel done, there's a triglyceride, where does that fall in there?
Let's see if we don't find that on another slide.
I always do that, sorry. Sounds like
Triglycerides go up and down with your meals an awful lot, so they really don't mean that much in terms of heart attack risk. Some people have very high triglycerides and they have to be on special medicines, but that's pretty unusual. Chylomicrons are these ones that we get out of the intestinal tract that I just mentioned. They go straight into the lymphatic capillaries, travel up through the thoracic duct, remember that, and then into the junction of the jugular and the subclavian vein right up here in your neck into the venous system, and then they just circulate around in your blood. But they're cleared out very quickly. I think I'll just leave it. Here you go. Here you got the intestinal tract. Through the lacteals, absorbs those chylomicrons. They go up through the thoracic duct, through the lymphatic vessels, dump back into the bloodstream. They go into the circulatory system. As they go around in the capillaries, they can actually end up being laid down in the endothelium, the inner lining of the blood vessels. They can also be converted into skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, adipose cells, just stored as adipose cells and stored in the liver. People can get fatty liver. We used to see people from time to time that had a real fatty liver, and when you were at surgery, instead of the liver being nice and dark brown, it would actually be almost pale yellow with lots and lots of fat in it. Let's talk quickly about proteins. We manufacture 100 to 140,000 different proteins. One of them is collagen. One of them is actin, myosin, all the stuff that we use in our body that we've talked about for 3 terms now. All of the proteins are built out of 20 amino acids. That's all the choices that we have, is 20 amino acids. And then we hook them together in a very specific order, and that's what creates a protein. And you remember from 112 that the first order of organization was the order of the amino acids. It was set up by DNA, and then it had to fold just right, and then it had to come around and fold back on itself just right, and then oftentimes some of the proteins were a combination of several things, like hemoglobin is a combination of 4 of them, and so that's the quaternary organization level of proteins. We've all got lots of free amino acids floating around in our blood and in our cytosol and our cells that we can use to make new proteins with. If we don't have other energy sources available, we can generate ATP by breaking down amino acids in the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And like I said, this is often seen in starvation. If you're starving and you have no source of carbos coming in, you'll start tearing down your own body, tear down your own proteins. And so you may not, you don't get all that much ATP out of it, to be honest with you. This is I think you need to know just a little bit of something about deamination. Deamination means you're removing the nitrogen group from amino acids, okay? And when you so deamination takes the amino group off, here it is NH4, and it takes that amino acid and turns it into this ion right here, which is called ammonium ion. It also forms this thing here called a keto acid that can make you ketoacidotic, make you very sick if it builds up too much. But anyway, deamination is the word that means de-amino, taking the amino group off, and that's what this is right here. Now, the reason it's significant is because ammonium is a very toxic substance to us. We don't want to have any ammonia floating around in our blood, and when we do, we better hope we can process it and get rid of it very quickly, because it builds up and it does very bad things to us. These ammonium ions are very toxic, even in low concentrations. The liver cells, which is the primary source of the deamination, have enzymes that can then synthesize those ammonium ions, the things we don't want. We need to turn those ammonium ions into urea. Now, urea is a chemical that, if you don't know much about it now, you're going to know a lot about it when we get to the kidney next chapter. Okay? Urea is a water-soluble compound. It is excreted in our urine. We are all the time peeing out urea, because the urea was made from the ammonium that was released in our body by the breakdown of any amino acids. The urea cycle is the reaction sequence that produces urea. That's about all I want you to know about it, is there's a cycle that takes the ammonium and turns it into urea, because urea, remember, is water-soluble, it's non-toxic, it can circulate through our blood, and indeed, if any of you have ever looked at a set of blood results, you'll usually see a BUN. What's the BUN mean? Blood, urea, nitrogen. Okay, it's a standard test done on every set of electrolytes ever done, and it tells you how much urea is in the blood. You don't want too much of it. Normally, it should just circulate through your body a little bit and then be peed right out in your urine, and so it should stay very low. If it's starting to build up, it's because you've got kidney failure or you've got too much protein being broken down all at once.
When I would draw it, it would usually be paired with creatinine.
Right. Creatinine is another measure of kidney function. Yep, BUN and creatinine will give you a ton of information about your kidney function, which we'll get to next chapter. So, think about it like this. You've got ammonium ions that are created by the breakdown of these amino acids. Carbon dioxide, another waste product. They're hooked together basically in the urea cycle, and they're turned into this structure right here. which I don't care that you memorize, but just remember that urea is a water-soluble, non-toxic substance that does have 2 nitrogens in it. It's taken 2 ammonium ions up there to make urea, and once it says in the form of urea, it's non-toxic to you and it can be peed out because it's water-soluble. I've alluded to this a couple times already today, saying that proteins can be broken down to form ATP. When glucose and lipid reserves are not adequate, the liver cells can start breaking down proteins. This is our last choice for energy. The last thing we want to use, the last thing we want to burn up is our proteins, because they were so much work to create. It took so much energy. They took so many of those, those peptide bonds, and remember those ribosomes, remember those little tri things that had 3 little messenger RNAs that had to bring them all in and line them up. You remember all that translation and that transcription? Well, that's a very expensive process to make those proteins, and once you've made them, you really don't want to be burning them up just to make a little glucose. You should just keep eating a little glucose along the way. Okay. Why is it bad to break down proteins? What are 3 factors against protein catabolism? Proteins are hard to break apart. It produces ammonium ion, which is toxic, and the proteins form the most important structural and functional components of cells. If you tear down your muscles, you can't move. You become weak. You become defenseless, so to speak. So the last thing in the world you really want to do is break down your proteins. Just a minute about protein synthesis. We synthesize about half of the amino acids. And so what that means is we have some of our amino acids are what we call non-essential. We can take essential amino acids and combine them together to form some of the other amino acids, the total of 20 amino acids. And once again, I don't want you to memorize these. I just want you to realize that there are 10 essential amino acids that we have to take in our diet. There are 8 these 8 we have to take in because they are not synthesized. And then there's 2 more, that arginine and histidine, we really can't make enough of them, so we really need to take those in. And these are all the essential ones, all the 10 of them there, 8 there and 2 there. So let's talk a little bit about starvation and how we make it from meal to meal. Sounds like a tough deal, doesn't it? But think about it. We don't sit and eat all day long, right? So if we did, we would only have to, we could continually be digesting, we could continually be processing those foods. We wouldn't have to have any reserve because we know we're always going to be eating, but it doesn't work that way. We eat, and then we go into kind of a starvation cycle, even if it's only 8 hours during the night. It's sort of a starvation cycle. There's 5 basic metabolic tissues where all this metabolic stuff goes on: liver, fat, skeletal muscle, neural tissues, and some other peripheral tissues. I don't know what that list means. It doesn't mean anything to me. But you do have these, there's some chemicals that I want to explain to you because you're going to hear a lot about them in the future. One of them is called ketone bodies. Ketone bodies, anybody know what a ketone is? Remember from your organic chemistry? Did you ever have organic chemistry? Huh?
No.
It's double bond O. That makes it a ketone. Guess you haven't learned that yet. Yeah, you will one of these years. Anyway, that's what ketones are. 3 main types: acetoacetate, acetone, beta-hydroxybutyrate. Our liver can't really catabolize those and break those down. So if you're building up too many of them, they just build up. They are acids in solution. That means they make you more acid. They lower your pH. These ketone bodies do. And fasting will always produce ketosis. Another situation that leads to really bad ketosis is diabetes. Right. Now, what's the problem in diabetes? Why would they have ketone bodies build up? What do diabetics lack?
Insulin.
And what does insulin do?
Insulin.
Controls your blood sugar, but how does it do that? By making it possible for the blood, the sugar that's out in your blood, to get inside of the cells. In other words, it's kind of like sugar everywhere, but not a drop to eat, because it can't get into the cells and it just builds up. So that's sort of like fasting. They're not being able to break it down. And they can build a very high concentration of ketone bodies in their body fluids. They become very acidotic. That's called diabetic ketoacidosis. People that are diabetic and become ketoacidotic usually have their blood sugars extremely high, maybe 1600, whereas it's normally 100. They have a very fruity breath, real sweet and smelly. That's the ketones that are in their body. Ketones, if you ever worked in a chemistry lab, you could go to the shelf that had a bunch of different ketones on it. You could open all the bottles and they all smell sweet and fruity. Anyway, so ketonemia is a buildup of these ketones in the bloodstream, lowering the pH, making you acidotic. Ketoacidosis is a very dangerous drop in blood pressure caused by these ketone levels. Now just remember that the pH, normal pH in the body is 7.4. That's right. And it's very tightly controlled between, say, 7.37 and 7.42 or 7.43. I mean, it's very closely controlled by all the buffer systems and so forth that we have. But when people get ketoacidosis, they can get extremely acidy. The pH may fall as low as 7. By the time it gets down to about 7.15, they're usually in coma. The brain can't stand that degree of acidosis, and they're out of it. They're probably going to be having cardiac arrhythmias. Their heart's going to be beating irregularly, and a lot of them are going to be dead. So ketoacidosis is a very severe problem. You need to get the pH corrected. You need to get the blood sugar corrected very quickly with medicines. These are very dangerous conditions. Okay, drop that subject. Let's move to another one, and it's called nutrition. You guys know you have to take a nutrition class to go to nursing school. Have you taken it?
Yeah.
Was it good?
No, really.
Was it stupid?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't understand the whole thing. I probably took 2 hours of nutrition in my whole medical school career, which is was a real defect in our training because we physicians didn't understand nutrition very well. The problem is I'm not sure how much you guys learn in those classes either. I think it could be tied in here to A&P if we added it right along in here and made this a 3-week segment on nutrition and metabolism instead of making it one day like it is. Anyway, so hemostasis, we're all trying to be hemostatic. We can only stay hemostatic and maintain our own hemostasis if we eat enough fluids, we drink enough fluids, we drink enough, eat enough organic substrates like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, enough minerals, vitamins to meet all the demands that we have. And nutrition is the absorption of nutrients from food. So we have all of these wonderful body requirements. And of course, this is pretty nebulous science. I mean, we like to think we know exactly what it takes to eat to make us healthy, right? But the food pyramid has changed 24 times in the last 50 years because the scientists are constantly debating what is the best mix of grains and dairy and carbs and proteins and so forth. And it's really not clear. I think we're getting closer to it probably, but it's still sort of a nebulous science because it relates so much to exercise and activity and all that stuff as well. So we have this food groups thing and, a balanced diet, and you had it in elementary school. Remember the food pyramid that they taught you in 3rd grade and then again in 5th grade and then, But obviously a balanced diet contains everything you need in order to maintain homeostasis. Enough substrates to generate energy, enough essential amino acids and enough fatty acids, enough minerals and vitamins, and it must also include water. And water, you have to have enough water to replace your urine every day, your feces every day, and what evaporates off of you, sweat, insensible perspiration as well as sensible perspiration, as well as water loss in your breath. Because I'm still clogging up this glass every time I expire. I'm doing that all day long, which really means I'm blowing out water with every breath, and you all are too. So that's that's water we've got to replace. Oh, here's a few-year-old pyramid plan. I just think it's sort of silly. It's not silly, but it's just it's not really totally understood. Let's talk for a minute now about nitrogen. Nitrogen atoms are not really stored in our body. Now, remember when we were studying the gases, and what did we learn about nitrogen in the air? It's the big one. 79% of the air we breathe in is nitrogen. So there's 4 times more nitrogen in each breath than there is oxygen, right? Since we don't store it, we've either got to continually eat it and we've got to recycle it. Now, we've already talked about some recycling of nitrogen because when we talked about deamination and taking those nitrogens from those amino acids off, and then they turn into ammonium ions, and then we got to send them through the urea cycle to turn them into urea, because that way it'll be water soluble, and that way it's not toxic, and we can pee it out and get rid of it, so forth. So we've already kind of talked about recycling nitrogen a little bit. But where do we get nitrogen in our diet? Can we just go, it's 80% nitrogen, right? Can't we just take a breath and digest that nitrogen and take that nitrogen and convert it into proteins? No, we really can't. In fact, plants can't either, unless they happen to be what's called a nitrogen fixer. Yes, any of you agricultural specialists, farmers out here? Anyway, let's talk about nitrogen balance, because this is something that we do talk about a lot, especially in very sick people. We talk about their nitrogen balance. Is Mr. Jones in nitrogen balance these days, guys, when you're making rounds? Well, I don't know. We're getting 50 grams of protein into him. He's losing 30 grams of protein in his urine. We're measuring his 24-hour urines, and we're measuring how much nitrogen is actually coming out of him, and his weight is going up, and. So nitrogen is something that gets a fair amount of talk in sick people and in hospitals. Obviously, we want to be in balance most of the time of our life, but yet if you're a kid and you're growing, you want to be in positive nitrogen balance. You want to be taking in more proteins and more stuff that has nitrogen in it, because you need that nitrogen to build new proteins, to grow, and to repair things, and so forth. The biggest negative nitrogen balance I've ever seen are patients that have had a big burn. because they're just weeping proteins, mucus and everything is just weeping out through their skin because they don't have skin. They've just got a burned surface. And it takes tremendous calories and tremendous amounts of protein to get them back to where they're quit losing. Otherwise, they're losing weight. Sometimes they're losing 4 pounds a day. Even with a hyperalimentation line, and you're giving them high concentrations of nitrogen and proteins, and fats and sugars, everything, it's just impossible to keep up with because they're losing so much out through their skin. So, positive nitrogen balance, growing children, athletes, pregnant women need to be in positive nitrogen balance. This is why you ladies usually gain so much damn weight, because you say, oh, I'm just eating for 2, which you are, but you're probably eating for 4, and that's why you gain 80 pounds. Right, Susie?
I gained 25 pounds.
25, oh, that's good.
And that's what you're supposed to get.
There you go, that's right, that's about right. Okay. I just had to pick on you.
I know I'm fluffy, but there.
So that's one of the examples of people that need to be in positive nitrogen balance because they're supplying for 2. Negative nitrogen balance is the perfect example. Is the one I just mentioned of somebody who is had a big burn and they're losing a lot through their skin. All the mucus and proteins they're weeping off of them are just a mess.
What would be another example of somebody who would be in?
Starvation. A couple of points to know about vitamins is that we have some fat-soluble vitamins, and they're easy to remember. It's ADEK, A-D-E-K. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, which means if you're like me, you have lots of them stored up in your fat. They can get into your cells, and you can have enough that you can go a long, long time without taking more of them. Vitamin A is important because it's the one that you see with, right? You can get it in carrots a lot. Vitamin D is the one that keeps you from getting rickets. It's in your skin. It's converted into D3, and then it goes and it's converted to calcitriol. Remember, calcitriol helps you absorb more calcium out of your gut and so forth. Vitamin E, I'm not sure I know what vitamin E is really all about. A few years ago, everybody was taking it because it was supposed to be the long life. Take enough vitamin E, you'll live forever. Kind of pseudo vitamin. Vitamin K is certainly important. It's the one that really helps you with your clotting factors, and we've talked about that in terms of warfarin, which is basically the old. It's not old. It's still used in 95% of all cases of blood thinning. You need somebody on blood thinners, you give them warfarin. Anybody know why it's called warfarin? I told you this story before.
I know it's rat.
It's rat poison, that's right. It was used to kill wharf rats. The wharfs at the harbors were full of rats, and they came up with this stuff called warfarin, which you would put and sprinkle it over wheat, and then the rats would eat it like crazy. It would thin their blood so much that they would just start bleeding spontaneously. Usually they were bleeding inside of themselves. And when a rat starts to bleed, what's the first thing he wants? He wants water to drink to kind of replace his volume. And so he would go out and go find water and die somewhere else, which is great because then you didn't have a bunch of dead rats in your storage place. And the drug is called warfarin because of that. The nice thing about warfarin is that it can be reversed very quickly, and somebody that's taking warfarin as a blood thinner for either for a heart valve or for strokes or whatever problem they might have You can give them a shot of vitamin K, and within about 15 minutes, their clotting is back to normal. So vitamin K is very important, including to make the clotting factors that make you clot your blood. I'm not going to go into this. I think I've said about all I want you to know about the different vitamins. You should know A, D, E, and K. The other thing I would say about these 4 vitamins is these are 4 vitamins that you can kill yourself with. You can overdose on A, D, E, and K. So they shouldn't be just taken willy-nilly. Just take 10 pills of them. It'll build up and can cause real problems. Here's the effects of the excesses of these 4, and they're rather significant. Water-soluble vitamins, all the rest of them, it doesn't matter how many you take. This is what I think is really the tragedy in America, that people spend billions and billions of dollars on vitamins. Most all of the vitamins that are on the list are water-soluble vitamins, which means the more you take, the more you pee. You just take them in, your body pees them right out if you don't need them. And the fact is, we need such tiny amounts of these things that to spend money on vitamins is probably a total waste of money. And yet that keeps being reported month after month. And new study says this and says the same thing over and over again. That people, the advertising done for vitamins is so powerful that everybody thinks they just have to take vitamins. You don't need to take vitamins. If you want to take a vitamin, take a 1-a-day vitamin. You can buy a year's worth for $3, and that's all the vitamins you'll ever need is a multivitamin once a day. All these other things, it's just an industry. They're just selling stuff. And of course, it's not controlled by the FDA. It doesn't require a prescription, so it really is under no control. And although they may say they have 400 units of vitamin E in this pill, it may have 2 units of vitamin E, and it may have 20,000 units of vitamin E. You have no idea. Most of these things aren't even measured. They're just produced and sold.
They taught us that in nutrition.
They what? They told you that in nutrition?
Yeah.
So there you go. That's good. That's a reason to take nutrition. Hey, all right.
Well, they didn't teach us, they just told me to read that section.
Yeah.
Just read this section of the book.
It's better when I explain it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It sort of sinks in, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit more, yeah.
I gotta quit talking so much. Okay. Average U.S. diet contains too much of some things. We all know that. Contributes to obesity, heart disease, arteriosclerosis, high blood pressure, and diabetes. We're going to have more diabetics in our country than anything else here if the obesity rate continues to grow as it's doing. It all boils down to metabolism. How much do we burn every day, and how much do we take in? If you take in more than you burn, you're going to gain weight. If you burn more than you take in, you're going to lose weight. It's really pretty simple. And so to do that, we have made a big study of calorimetry. Calorimetry is the study of calories. It's really the study of heat. And what they do is they have these things called calorimeters. They put a hamburger in it, and they light it on fire, and they heat it up, and they measure how much heat they're putting into it, and then they measure how much heat is taken out of it, and they take the amount they put in, subtract it from the total amount that came out, and they figure the excess is the amount that came from burning the food. That's the number of calories in the food. So it's very sophisticated, and we can calculate the number of calories in foods very, very well. What is the definition of a calorie? This is important to know. A calorie is the energy required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So a gram of water, remember, is 1 cc. It's a centimeter by a centimeter by a centimeter, cubic centimeter of water, and to raise it 1 degree Celsius, which is 9/5 of a degree Fahrenheit, remember? So it's almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's a tiny amount of heat. because it's a tiny amount of water. And so when you see the word calorie written on anything, what they're talking about is a capital C calorie. Capital C calorie is the same as a kilocalorie, 1,000 calories. Okay, so the definition of a kilocalorie is the energy needed to raise 1 kilogram of water, which is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. That's a liter. 1 liter of water, right? 1 degree. Okay, that's the one we always talk about is for calories. So this is something you ought to know right here down at the bottom, because lipids, fats, have by far more calories in them than anything else. Calories, I mean, lipids have about 9.5, or just say 9 calories per gram. So you eat 1 gram of butter, 1 little cubic centimeter of butter, and that's got about 9 calories in it. You eat 1 little cubic centimeter of carbohydrate, like sugar or flour, and that's only going to be about 4 calories, and the same for protein. So the best way to lose weight is simply to cut down on the amount of fat, because fat's the one that carries the big calories in it. 944. That's worth knowing.
I've got a question about it. So you're using weight with water in relation to a calorie weight. And why weight? I mean, water can be more or less dense, or
Right, these are all based on grams. I'm saying, but it's going to be pretty close to that. I'm trying to show you how little butter you have to eat, what a little block of butter you have to eat to have 9 calories in it. That was my teaching point. But yes, it is done by mass or grams. Let's talk about metabolic rates, because one thing that's really cool is if we could just exercise all the time, we would burn all these additional calories and we would all lose a ton of weight. And you guys have seen these shows on TV. Jeez, it woke me up in the middle of the night the other night when I fell asleep and left the TV on. It's that show, The Biggest Loser. The Biggest Loser. Well, those guys are exercising hours and hours every day. So, of course, they're burning thousands and thousands of calories. And, 2 summers ago when I rode my bike across the country, I wore my little Polar watch right there. And every morning when I would get on my bike, I would punch it, and I had my little chest strap on. And every day when I got off my bike at 5 or so in the afternoon, it would read 7,400, 6,200. I mean, I was burning an extra 6,000 or 7,000 calories every single day. So nonetheless, so needless to say, you could eat like a pig on a bike trip. You can eat all you want because you'll still lose weight. And indeed, I lost 20 pounds. I had blueberry pie a la mode for breakfast several times. I mean, in addition to hash browns and eggs and bacon and steak and whatever. I mean, we were eating like crazy men, but we were burning so much calories that it was okay.
Are you gonna go on another bike trip this summer?
I don't know. You want to go with me?
I'll go to Disneyland and have a churro.
Yeah. So the more energy we're building or burning is the higher our metabolic rate. There's one thing you need to understand here. It's called the BMR. You've probably heard the term before.
Yeah.
BMR means basal metabolic rate. Now, there is a basal metabolic rate for all of us, for each of us. And what it means is if you could measure the amount of calories that you're burning per hour or per day by just sitting around resting. You can't be asleep, but you got to be awake, but you don't have to be doing anything. So it is the basal. That means the lowest possible metabolic rate you can be at. There's some standardized testing. But I think the point that's important to understand is that it's not, you don't measure BMR while running or while exercising or anything like that, because that wouldn't be basal, would it? basal metabolic rate is always just sitting around taking it easy. How do you really measure the energy? Well, the way you do it is by measuring how much they breathe. And basically the way they do it is they measure how much oxygen you take in. You're usually breathing through a tube. They measure what percent oxygen you're taking in and what percent of oxygen you're putting out. And so it's used to calculate how much oxygen you are actually consuming. The more oxygen you're consuming, the more energy you're burning. It's really just that simple. But I think the thing I want you to understand is that BMR is never exercise related. It's always just basal metabolic rate. Thermoregulation, heat production. BMR estimates the rate of energy use because most energy that you burn is released as heat. If you don't use it, you release it as heat, and heat is very important for homeostasis. You want to be making plenty of heat, but you also don't want to exceed what you can get rid of, either by breathing the heat out, and same as when I breathe on this glass over here and fog it up, I'm also heating it up, so I'm getting rid of heat. Every time we expire, the air we're breathing out is much warmer than the air we breathed in, right? Our body temperature is so important to control because all the enzymes in our body operate on a very limited temperature range, and we need to keep our body temperature really between about 99.2 and 98.0. I mean, within a degree, really, we need to control our body temperature. If we get below about 97, we're probably going to be shivering. We're going to be becoming hypothermic. If we go above 101, you're going to feel pretty darn crummy and you're going to have a fever. So we have all kinds of mechanisms to keep our body temperature regulated. And we've touched on some of this before. We're producing, remember, 60% of all this energy we're burning is being released as a byproduct of metabolism. And then when we start exercising, either physical exercise or increased metabolic activity for some reason, we're generating even more heat. Heat is retained in our body by water. Water is a really great heat holder, right? For our body temperature to remain constant, we've got to be losing it off to the environment all the time. Mechanisms of heat transfer, these are physics words that I don't think are that important, but basically this is 4 ways our body gets rid of heat. Radiation means heat that radiates off our body. Conduction is like when you touch your tongue to the flagpole and it conducts, the heat actually conducts from your body to the environment. Convection is like a convection oven. If you have heat, air blowing past you, that increases the amount of heat that can come off of you. And of course, evaporation is a major loss of heat. When sweat evaporates from you, you lose a lot of heat. So those are 4 main processes that we use to get rid of heat. And then it goes through them here in these next few slides, but I'm just going to slip on past those things. I think I've talked about insensible water loss before, but each hour we are losing about 25 cc's of water coming straight through our skin, not through our sweat glands, just going right out through the skin itself. Sensible perspiration, on the other hand, is stuff you can see. It's actually coming out of the sweat glands, forming little drops on your skin. And this is interesting because you can easily sweat 4 liters an hour. 4 liters an hour. 4 of those things an hour. 8 of those bottles like you've got, you can sweat 8 of those in an hour. Well, think about how much water you've got to drink to keep doing that for very long. What regulates our heat? It's up in our hypothalamus. I think we've said that before. It's and the areas of your hypothalamus, remember where that is, right above your pituitary gland. And that's where our heat controls are. How do we control it? How does our hypothalamus control it? Well, it can control some of these chemical reactions and slow down the heat production. It can certainly increase or decrease the amount of heat we're losing to the environment. Just like when in the winter, when our hands are cold, they look really pale because we're not sending much blood to the skin in order to hold the heat inside of us. And when it's really hot outside, our cheeks and so forth will be really red and we'll be giving off a lot of heat. We're running all this blood we can up past the skin so it can convect off and radiate off to get rid of the heat. Further, it can be supported by behavioral modifications. I promise you, if you were sweating 4 liters an hour, what's the first thing you think you would do?
Water. Take off your clothes.
I'd love to see that. I didn't say it. No, we'd go find some cool place in the shade, wouldn't we? We'd turn a fan on, we'd get in the air conditioning. I'm sorry. Anyway.
You want to put a coat on?
There you go. Lots of, yeah, there you go. Anyway, I think I've said enough about heat control. Another thing we do is breathe deeper, because every time we breathe, we're losing heat. That's why a dog pants. Why, dogs when they're hot, they're panting to get rid of the heat through their breath. They can't sweat like we can, so they kind of need that. I think I've said enough about that too. If I was going to say, talk for a few minutes about hypothermia, I would just give you my Boy Scout experiences and say that when you start shivering, you are too cold. If you are outside in the winter and you start shivering, or somebody you're with starts shivering, that should be the automatic end of the hike. That should be the automatic end of the exploration or whatever you're doing outside. When somebody starts shivering and they can't stop, you get in a tent, you get in a sleeping bag, you get dry, because a lot of times the reason you're getting so cold is because you're wet. But shivering is a very serious thing, because once you start shivering, your body is doing everything it can to keep your temperature up to normal, and if it can only shiver for so long, and then your body temperature goes way down when you quit shivering. So just remember that shivering is a bad deal. I think I've said all these things about this. This has to do with this thing called countercurrent multiplication, sort of. If you take the blood vessels that are going down your arm, here's a warm environment, and you notice the blood comes out here, and it sends a lot of big blood vessels out by the skin. That's so that they can give off their heat. Whereas in cold weather, you send the blood down through the middle of the arm, and you bring it back through the middle of the arm, and you don't send any blood up through these superficial veins up by the skin. That's so that you don't lose that heat. I think I'll just leave that at that. Shivering thermogenesis is what we were just talking about. Shivering can increase your heat generation 400%, but just remember it can only do it for a certain period of time, and then you're out of energy to do that with. Remember that children lose their heat much quicker than adults, because children have so much more surface area compared to their size. So I know whenever we would have a baby out in the Dalles that needed to be transferred down here to Dorenbecker or something, they would always send a special ambulance up to the Dalles. It's 90 miles up there. And when that thing got there, it was 104 degrees inside. And they take that baby and put the baby in an incubator at 104 and take it out to the truck, the ambulance, keep it at 104 the whole way down, because babies lose heat so fast even if it's, even if the room seems warm enough, it's not warm enough for babies. So heat is really important in kids. And I think that's important that we all know in healthcare, because remember, infants cannot shiver. They don't know how to. Their body can't do it. And so their body temperatures are much less stable. And for those mamas in the crowd, it's pretty common for your kid to spike a temperature to 105 and then come back down to 95 and then go back up to 104 all in the course of 4 hours. Their body temperatures are very much less stable than they are in adults because they're so small. The last thing is that kids have brown fat. Brown fat is not really brown fat. What it is fat tissue with lots and lots of little blood vessels running through it. So it's highly vascularized fatty tissue. And the reason it's back here on their back mostly, it has lots and lots of mitochondria. It's usually found between their shoulder blades, around their neck, and their upper body. And this brown fat can generate lots of heat very quickly to warm babies up on their own. This is about the only defense they have. Brown fat is usually pretty much all gone by 6 months of age, so it's something that only really helps them for the first few months of life. Brown fat, something to know about. I think I've said that. An infant can quickly accelerate their metabolic heat generation by 100% by burning brown fat. Brown fat's pretty much gone in us adults. We have very little of it, but that's okay because we are able to shiver. So adults can shiver, kids can. Adipose tissue fat is a good insulator, keeps us warm. You've probably all been outside to a football game or something with a really heavy person and they're wearing a t-shirt and you're wearing 14 layers of clothes to try to stay warm. Well, that's because they have all that good insulation on. Our body temperature goes up and down about a centigrade degree every day. It usually peaks during the day. It's a little bit varying. Back in the day, the only way to really know when a lady was ovulating was to take her temperature every day. So every lady who was trying to get pregnant would have a thermometer beside her bed, and every morning before she would get out of bed or drink a cup of coffee or anything, she would take her temperature, same time, same place every day. And if you measured that every day all month long, you could figure out when it was that she actually ovulated. Because when she ovulated, it would jump up a little bit, and so then she'd have to jump back into bed with her husband in order to attempt to
conceive a baby.
Have a baby. Yeah. Pyrexia is another name for fever, body temperature elevation, and I think I can say that. That's enough to say about it. Just remember that fevers are not always normal. They're not always abnormal. They're not always a sign of sickness. Sometimes fevers, you can run a fever if you're going to be exercising in warm weather. It's good to have a fever because it enables you to get rid of more heat more quickly. That's it. Okay, now I think the chapter is very complicated. I think it's very long and very complex. Obviously, there's lots of chemical formulas and cycles and all that stuff. Please take that all with a grain of salt. I just want you to kind of know the major concepts, the ones that I tried to talk about here today. This chapter will be handled very lightly on the exam, especially compared to the other two big chapters, the respiratory and the digestive chapter. I think it's like 45, 45, 10. 45 questions on respiratory, 45 questions on digestive, and 10 on this metabolic chapter. So,
Yeah.